You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've got another major blow to Donald Trump's legal team. The DC bar is taking action against three Trump-linked attorneys. So, what happened in this instance, and what are next steps here?
Yeah, so DC bar investigators have concluded that there's enough evidence to open an investigation and have basically a formal inquiry, a hearing into three Trump lawyers, Julie Haller and Brandon Johnson. These were lawyers who were on the so-called Kraken team, together with Sidney Powell, filing fraudulent lawsuit after fraudulent lawsuit, in their desperate attempt to try to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And then there's a third lawyer, Larry Joseph. Now, he's a close ally with people like John Eastman. And what he did was he was supporting, remember the Louis Gohmert lawsuit that was designed to do what? Pressure Mike Pence into trying assist, in overturning the results of the 2020 election. This was some really bad, nefarious, unethical lawyering that went on by these three Trump affiliated, Trump associated lawyers. And the DC bar investigators decided that there was so much evidence of fraud by these lawyers that they wanted to open an investigation, have a formal inquiry, and if misconduct is found, try to hold them accountable. So, for example, the allegations are that these lawyers engaged in making knowingly false representations about, for example, alleged foreign interference with the Dominion voting machines. And of course, all of that turned out to be false. And that is just one of the allegations that is being lodged against these three attorneys.
Now, in this type of scenario, what are the prospects that these Trump-linked attorneys will ever be able to practice law again?
I would say slim to none, and slim is fading fast, right? Think of Rudy Giuliani. He has been suspended from the practice of law in New York. He has been suspended from the practice of law in Washington, D.C. Basically, he is pending permanent disbarment. And so many other lawyers who were engaged in this sort of dirty scheme to try to help Donald Trump unlawfully retain the power of the presidency have been sanctioned by any number of courts. John Eastman, for example, the California bar held a proceeding about his misconduct, and that's pending final resolution, but he has been, quote, found culpable. So if these lawyers go through a bar hearing by the DC bar, and they are found to have engaged in misconduct, two questions. One, what will the sanctions be? And then the other question is there any chance that they could end up practicing law anywhere?
Well, to that exact point, for example, if the DC bar finds them culpable and prevents them from practicing law in DC, does that preclude them from practicing law in other states, other jurisdictions, if they've lost their license in one?
Effectively, yes, right? We have 50 states, and each state has its own bar council and its own licensing procedure if you are to become a barred attorney in a particular state. And the practices and the regulations vary from state to state. But what I can tell you, Brian, is pretty much in every state, if you apply to be a lawyer, right, you try to take and pass the bar and become licensed to practice in a particular state, one of the questions that you will be asked is, have you ever been sanctioned? Has there ever been a finding of professional misconduct lodged against you? Have you ever been disbarred? Have you ever been the subject of a disciplinary proceeding? And effectively, if they are found by the DC bar to have engaged in unethical practices or knowingly made false representations in furtherance of this, Trump-related litigation, it's going to be the death knell. They're not going to be admitted to any state bar, and it will effectively end their legal career.
Well, what if they're already admitted to other bars? Like, if you've lost your ability to practice law in one jurisdiction, how can anybody in another jurisdiction have confidence in you if you've already got a license in Virginia, in New York, in Florida, for example?
They can't. And there is some pretty healthy reciprocity that goes on as between and among the various state bars. Think about Rudy Giuliani as an example. He went through a disciplinary procedure up in New York. He was found to have engaged in unethical conduct. He was suspended pending permanent disbarment. And then what happened? The DC bar where Rudy is also admitted to practice law, got wind of it and picked up on it, and they ran him through the same procedures, and he was suspended from practicing in DC, again, pending permanent disbarment. So, you know what? Every state bar will pay attention to these kind of proceedings that are being conducted by other state bars. And, you know, these folks are not going to be able to sort of duck and dodge and go hide in another state and be able to practice law.
Okay, so just to be clear, it's not like, for example, if you abuse the system in one state, that you can only be disbarred in that state and then other states can't look at it. If you abuse the system in one state's bar, then the 50 other states can also use that as a predicate to open up an investigation to see if you can keep your license in those jurisdictions as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Now, each state will have to run that attorney who is alleged to have engaged in unethical conduct through their own state procedures,
Right.
adjudicate those procedures, give the attorney an opportunity to be heard, give them, you know, some level of due process before sanctioning them, reprimanding them, suspending them, disbarring them. But yeah, once you have suffered that consequence in one state, it's going to follow you no matter where you try to go and practice law.
Glenn, do outcomes like this one make it less likely then that Trump will be able to attract legal talent in his raft of ongoing prosecutions?
It's hard to conceive of Donald Trump attracting lesser legal talent than he already has
Yeah.
representing him. I know that sounds a little snarky, but when you see the Elena Habas of the world representing Donald Trump in the federal lawsuit up in New York that was brought by E. Jean Carroll, the defamation case, you know, it's hard to envision lawyers performing more poorly than Elena Haba. I don't understand why any lawyer would ever choose to represent Donald Trump because, one, it's not exactly a righteous cause. Now, I understand everybody is entitled to zealous representation, but you know that doesn't mean you know every attorney is going to be willing to undertake a client like Donald Trump who tried to bring an end to American democracy. Plus, you know, he's always being alleged of not paying his lawyers. So it's really hard to conceive of top-notch legal representation, you know, still wanting to represent Donald Trump in any of his criminal or civil cases.
Okay, and one final question, going back to these disbarment proceedings. How long does this process usually take, and when can we expect some type of a resolution here? Because isn't there some degree of urgency when you have lawyers who are still able to practice, who may have committed such glaring abuses that they can be disbarred? By like, isn't there a risk by allowing them to keep their law licenses and not moving on this quickly?
It does seem like time is of the essence. These are not the kind of people who should be undertaking to represent anybody, right? Because people deserve competent, honest, ethical representation. And it sure doesn't look like they're going to get it from the Julie Hallers and the Brandon Johnsons and the Larry Josephs of this sort of sad, you know, escapade. But what I will tell you, Brian, is these bar council investigations can sometimes drag on seemingly endlessly, month after month after month. And so I would not expect these things to be wrapped up anytime soon when we are just learning that the DC bar is opening this inquiry, this investigation into these three Trump affiliated lawyers.
Okay, well, with that said, we will stay on top of this as soon as we have any updates. So for those watching, if you want to follow along as soon as we do have any of those updates, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.